Hi, I'm Dongshang. Welcome to Digging into China, where we explore China in depth to reveal unique perspectives. Xi Jinping is deeply fixated on GDP. The 2024 target of 5% growth must be achieved, but with the economic data for October and November so poor, there are only two ways to meet this goal. The first is to artificially boost GDP in December. The second is to rely on the National Bureau of Statistics for assistance. The analysis shows that the social financing in October and November was too weak to support the idea of a sharp GDP increase in December. So in the end, is the National Bureau of Statistics the only solution? It turns out, yes. Just before Christmas, the National Bureau of Statistics made a move that really made me laugh. They quietly revised the way real estate was factored into the GDP calculation, which magically added 3.3 trillion yuan to 2023's GDP. At a first glance, it might seem like a National Bureau of Statistics made a mistake. By raising last year's base, doesn't that make it harder to reach this year's growth target? But that's not the case. Raising last year's base doesn't matter because it allows this year's number to be even higher. The key point is this: the logic has to hold up and the numbers must be credible. GDP figures aren't just about preserving the Xi Jinping's image, but also affect the legitimacy of various fiscal policies that have been implemented. First, let's discuss what exactly the National Bureau of Statistics changed in their calculation methods and how it affected the GDP results. According to the announcement, the change was limited to the method used for calculating housing services for urban residents, shifting from previous cost approach to the current rent-based approach. What does this mean? Let me explain with an example. Previously, China used the cost method to calculate housing GDP. For instance, if a 100 square meter house was completed this year with a construction cost of 200,000 yuan and a depreciation period of 50 years, the annual construction cost would be 4,000 yuan. Adding in annual property and maintenance fees, say 2,000 yuan, the total cost of the house included in GDP would be 6,000 yuan per year. So how is GDP calculated using the rent method? It's simple. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, if the same 100 square meter house is rented out for 2,000 yuan per month, the GDP is calculated based on an annual rent of 24,000 yuan. As you can see, while the cost method only added 6,000 yuan to the GDP, switching to the rent-based method boosted it threefold. Pretty impressive, right? This is the trick the National Bureau of Statistics used to inflate GDP. Now you can see why Xi Jinping feels confident in setting a 5% GDP growth target for the new year. A small tweak in the calculation method and everything falls into place. To be fair, the rent method isn't something the National Bureau of Statistics invented. They copied it from the United States, where this is how housing GDP is calculated. However, applying the same method in different countries can lead to vastly different results. What does that mean? In the US, housing GDP is based on market rent. Whatever the market price is, that's what's used. But in China, do you think the market rent might be inflated? Isn't it possible that the National Bureau of Statistics simply decides what the rent should be for the year and use that figure? I'm not just making this up. We can see the truth when we look at the housing prices. People in China are well aware of the real prices. Just ask around or speak to someone who has bought or sold a property recently, and they'll tell you that many homes have had their prices slashed in half. Even in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, property prices have dropped significantly. However, if you check the monthly reports from the National Bureau of Statistics on housing price changes across 70 cities, you will see only slight fluctuations, usually just a fraction of a percent. What's even more shocking? Let's look at the latest real estate sales data from January to November for 2024. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, in the first 11 months, the sales area of newly built commercial housing was 861,180,000 square meters, and the total sales value was 8.52 trillion yuan. This gives an average price of 9,885 yuan per square meter. Now let's check November 2023's figure. I calculated that the average price of new homes back then was 10,478 yuan per square meter. So according to the statistics, the average price of new homes in 2024 is only 5.6% lower than 2023. Then I checked the data from November 2022 and I found that the average price back then was only 9,785 yuan per square meter. Looking at the National Bureau of Statistics compiled reports, we see that the new home prices in 2024 are actually higher than 2 years ago. Does this seem reasonable to you? Isn't it ridiculously inflated? If the National Bureau of Statistics can't even accurately capture real housing prices in China, how can they possibly determine the true rental prices in the real estate market? Ultimately, it's just a matter of setting the number to whatever they want. It's clear that the sudden change in the method of calculating housing GDP was driven by one goal: to artificially inflate GDP, ensure the 2024 target is met, and make the logic appear coherent. By that measure, they've succeeded. What's the point of inflating GDP? The most obvious benefit is safeguarding Xi Jinping's image. After all, GDP growth is something he's fixated on. But there is another, more practical advantage. It helps lower the government's debt-to-GDP ratio. Since this ratio is calculated by dividing government debt by GDP, a higher GDP automatically reduces the ratio. And with a lower debt ratio, the government gains more room to borrow. This means Xi Jinping can issue even more debt, making a 4% fiscal deficit target for 2025 seem entirely feasible. Reuters recently reported that China might issue 3 trillion yuan in special government bonds in 2025. In 2024, only 1 trillion yuan was issued, primarily for 2 new and 2 major projects. According to the report, the 3 trillion for 2025 would be allocated as following: 1.3 trillion for 2 new and 2 major projects, 1 trillion to support emerging productive forces, and 700 billion to recapitalize state-owned banks. While the accuracy of this report is uncertain, if it's true, the initial plan to allocate 1 trillion yuan for bank recapitalization would face a 300 billion shortfall. Where will that gap be filled? Likely through equity issuance in the stock market. Asia investors might want to keep a close eye on this potential development. The People's Bank of China has yet to deliver on its late September promise of another reserve requirement ratio cut by year-end, which now seems likely to be deferred to early 2025. This indirectly highlights that the National Bureau of Statistics has already set the stage to meet the 2024 GDP target, making further central bank support unnecessary. Seeing this crafty alteration of the GDP calculation method, I can't help but feel it's all over. Xi Jinping's simplistic approach to economics will never improve. Look at these sycophants teaching him shortcuts instead of solid, legitimate knowledge. Even a naive Chairman Xi with a very basic understanding of economics has been led astray by them. Then I came across a scathing end-of-year article in the Wall Street Journal, which was so absurd it actually made me laugh out loud. The Wall Street Journal reported that earlier last year, a consulting firm wrote a report for Xi Jinping, suggesting that China could fall into a deflationary spiral. But Xi Jinping wasn't concerned and even asked, "What's wrong with deflation? Don't people like lower prices?" Well, that's it. The simplistic economics of Xi Jinping's understanding of the economy is now confirmed. Given how his economic knowledge has remained stuck at such a basic level for so long, it's clear that his sycophants have only taught him shortcuts and tricks, and as with any shortcuts, it's bound to fail eventually. For example, the Statistical Bureau can artificially boost GDP by adjusting the calculation method, but if tax revenue doesn't keep pace, the inflated GDP will eventually be exposed. You can report strong GDP growth year after year, but if tax revenue is declining, what's the point of having a low government debt ratio? Tax revenue is the cash flow of a country. Once the cash flow is interrupted, even with low debt, the country can go bankrupt. So inflating GDP is merely a way for Xi Jinping to indulge himself. Without the tax revenue growth to back it up, it amounts to little more than self-entertainment. However, international rating agencies can easily see through these maneuvers. If they decide to downgrade the sovereign rating, they will, and no matter how low you make the government debt ratio, it won't help. Sometimes it feels like the bureaucratic elite within the system are inadvertently setting Xi Jinping up for failure. They don't offer him proper economics education, instead steering him toward misguided tactics. When things go wrong, it's Xi who takes the fall. And international media have a field day mocking him. The reason China is determined to meet a 5% GDP growth target in 2024 and maintain the same rate in 2025 is primarily to align with its debt reduction goals for these 2 years. While we've noted that GDP growth alone is meaningless without the tax revenue, China's main focus now is how to issue more debt. China is now firmly on a debt-driven economic path with no turning back. This means it can only continue down this route. On one hand, the government is increasing national debt issuance while local governments are relying on debt to service debt. In this scenario, GDP must be inflated. If GDP growth falls short, the government debt to GDP ratio will spike, restricting further debt issuance. So the strategy is to boost GDP first to issue more debt and deal with the tax revenue issues as they arise. Even if major credit rating agencies downgrade China's sovereign rating in the future, it won't happen immediately. The current focus is on the short term, with little regard for the long-term consequences on the economy. This time, the action of China's National Bureau of Statistics are particularly blatant. Unlike previous adjustments, they've directly changed the statistical method to boost 2023 GDP by 2.7%, a considerable increase. When GDP numbers are inflated so significantly, especially at the year's end, it raises suspicions about the real motivations behind it. It's clear that the aim is to artificially inflate last year's GDP, but given the already questionable credibility of the National Bureau of Statistics, it seems they've just thrown in the towel and decided to go for broke. Thank you so much for watching. If you find this video helpful, please like it, drop a comment below, and hit the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube suggest my videos to others. I'll be back with more content soon. Until then, be well.